here today for what's been a really exciting set of papers so far. So today I wanted to talk to you about some of my work in Tanzania that surrounds a voice hearing experience for Maasai women. I just want to note right out the gate that the photos in the slideshow are from the local area, but they're not linked to the claims on the slides in order to protect confidentiality. And I do have permission to use all of these photos. So there's no connection between the photo and the slide. I also want to acknowledge that I did not work on this project alone. I had several wonderful colleagues in medicine and psychiatry, Michael Compton and Luca Pacelli, also Marnie Chacon, who's one of my current PhD students. But most importantly, I think Elizabeth Lesate Molel, who herself is from this region of Tanzania and helped with the conceptualization and design and data collection and write-up and translation and everything. She's just been an incredible asset to the project. So I'm delighted that she's an author on this paper as well. So I have a history of doing research in Tanzania since 2013. I've done research in a clinic with mental health service users in Arusha, where we interviewed 48 voice hearers. I've also done research in Maasai land with mental health service users and traditional healers and religious healers. But today I want to talk to you about my work with a community mental health sample of Maasai women. So there's 71 Maasai women that we interviewed in the community. So this is a picture of one of the Maasai houses in one of the villages that we were visiting. So Tanzania is a lower middle income country now, but when I did this research, it was classified as a low income country. They received their independence from Britain in 1961. And the research I've been doing is in the Longido district, which is on the Tanzania-Kenya border, where there's a larger concentration of Maasai people because they're pastoralists who cross back and forth across that border. So the population isn't officially very large, although some people question how well the Maasai are counted by the government. And the data that was collected here was collected between June and August 2015 with COSTECH approval and with various permissions from local medical officials. So the sample that I mentioned was 71 Maasai women over the age of 18. They excluded people who reported using clinical mental health care. And we also excluded people who were family members of people who were using the local mental health care. So we didn't want, we thought that would be a more pure sample. We also excluded a few people who heard voices but were not, or who later reported hearing voices, but we didn't include them in the final count because they weren't Maasai, even though they were living in this very heavily Maasai area. We also recruited with a project coordinator who was working with a local NGO. And she was also from the area and a Maasai woman, and she had developed for the NGO relationships with leaders of local clusters of huts called bomas. And so she contacted village elders who recommended bomas that we could visit. And so we visited the bomas and went through a sort of group informed consent process to make sure everyone understood what was going on. And then we split off into various teams so that people could go through the assessments and the interviews. So our methods included assessments, which with some advice of my colleagues in global health included the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale. We used the Swahili version, but because this area, as you will see in a minute, is almost entirely of uneducated women who hadn't been to school, we translated it into Ma with our local research assistants and then back into Swahili to check and make sure everything was good for the scale. Then we also used the life events checklist, which is a screen for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so here we would read this list of 17 potentially traumatic events, and you would say if it happened to you, if you witnessed it, things like that. And then if you reported 2 or more of those, we would go ahead and screen you for PTSD. Another piece of the assessments was to screen for voice hearing, for auditory verbal hallucinations. And we used a pretty basic screen. So we asked, have you ever heard voices that no one else could hear, even if other people were present? Sometimes we had to explain that a little bit. If yes, then we asked them if they ever made effort to find the source, but weren't able to do so. So did they look around? Did they go outside? Did they try to talk back to the voice? And then we also made sure we clarified in the interviews that they were not describing something that happened while they were asleep, because other people can't hear what you hear when you're asleep. So that was an answer that made sense, but wasn't what we were looking for. So we also engaged in semi-structured interviews with the women. We talked about, what does it mean to be healthy? What does it mean to be happy, successful? Can you list some mental illnesses for us? Can you describe what it means to be mentally healthy, mentally ill? Where would you go for help? All these kinds of questions. So we had a comprehensive semi-structured interview about mental health and well-being and mental illness that we also were able to collect. So these are members of the research team. They included, as I mentioned, 3 local Maasai girls who were lucky enough to have been well educated despite the high level of no education in the area. And so they were pretty fluent in Swahili and English, which was great for me. And also in Maasai and the local dialect. So we didn't have any issues. They were all, within a few miles of the Bomas we were visiting. And we also had a local mental health coordinator with us some of the time. She did not speak Ma, but she was a psychiatric nurse and certainly introduced us to her patients who heard voices, and also was curious sometimes to go out with the team and see if there were people who needed her support. So Maasai land, as I mentioned, is on the Kenya-Tanzania border. So here's the Longido district in kind of dark blue. There's a road that runs between Nairobi and Arusha, a tarmac, a newer Chinese-built road, and that has really upped sort of migration in the area, also possibly the influence of some of these major cities. But Nairobi is still 3 or 4 hours from Longido, and Arusha is a good hour. So not a huge influence of the semi-urban or urban presence, except the ability to travel maybe more easily than ever before. So we know that the Maasai, even on both sides of the border, are experiencing health disparities. And we see some of this in the health inequity research that's been done on the Kenyan side with the Maasai population, where there's a 21.5-year gap between the overall life expectancy at birth of the Kenyan population versus the Maasai in Kenya, on the Kenya side. So that's a pretty big gap in life expectancy. We also see in studies of Meru, who is a neighboring group right in the same region, who's agricultural. The Maasai have much higher rates of food insecurity and also stunted child growth than the Meru people. So for example, only 21% of Meru children have stunted child growth, but 59% of the Maasai children are having stunted child growth right in the same pocket of the area. So this suggests that there's something going on with the Maasai that's particularly challenging. So I'm sorry, my slides keep changing without me, but I'm trying to stay on the right slide. So the pastoralists, the Maasai are pastoralists. There are 1.5 billion pastoralists worldwide. So this data can speak to larger groups of people. There are 300 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who live on less than $2 per day and also depend on livestock for their livelihoods and food, such as the Maasai. Research in the region has shown that even at a loss of 10 to 15% of livestock, that 80% of household income can be lost when you lose even 10 to 15% of your livestock. So these are very heavily livestock dependent groups. In Longido specifically, one study, they're all cited at the bottom here, but one of the studies found that a drought from 2008 to 2010 resulted in the loss of 60% of the cattle herds located there. So if 10 to 15% results in 80% income loss, then 60% of the cattle herds probably had a profound effect on households that was seen even before we got there in 2013, the first time. So there's tremendous drought and water insecurity in the area. This photo is taken in 2015, so you can see how there's, it's just a very arid landscape. The cattle aren't looking very healthy here, and there hadn't been rain for quite some time at this point. There are a lot of failed development projects littering the landscapes of NGOs who tried to come in and grow crops or create water projects in the area that just weren't taking hold. Here you can see that the traditional Maasai house is made of cow dung and sticks, and the women build all of this themselves, thatch. And so you need water to kind of keep your house in repair, keep the walls from cracking and from falling off. And so water was very important, not only for the livestock and for the children and the health and well-being of the women, but also just for basic everyday subsistence, having, a livable home. This is also considered to be a militarized wildlife conservation sector. Some of this has been covered by venues like the BBC. Weldon Michel used this term in 2020 when describing this area, particularly around the Ngorongoro conservation area. But there's a lot of conflicts between the Tanzanian government and the Maasai around land loss. For lucrative European tourism. The government's arguing that the population of the Maasai is growing too large in these conservation areas and trying to sort of extract them from Serengeti and Ngorongoro, other places where too many people would compromise the appearance of conservation. So there's a lot of violence going on in these areas that's been reported by some, but is very much suppressed in country as an event, but it seems to be happening based on reports from NGOs and the media. There's also, so this is a photo actually from 2018 when it had rained a bit. And so you can see it's much greener, there's these beautiful flowers, but unfortunately this invasive plant is not edible by the cattle. So it's pretty much taken over the landscape, as you can see, and is quite pretty in some ways, but is not edible for cattle or usable for humans in any way that they've figured out so far. So this is a new challenge for people living in this region. So a lot of anthropologists and development workers have written about how this kind of poverty and economic insecurity has driven down the age of marriage for Maasai women. And of course, the women who aren't aware of these kinds of indicators are also saying that the world has changed, things are happening differently. Women are being married off when they're younger. And that's really distressing for the young girls who are being married off, and also for the receiving group who has to help take care of someone who's really upset and not much help, honestly, early on. So this has been a difficult result of the loss of cattle in the area. There's also been a tremendous amount of male migration for work. So it leaves the women in charge when men go to Arusha and Nairobi to work in security or other paid positions, but they don't actually have much social power. So the traditional elders are still there running things, making decisions, a group of older men, and the women don't really have much say in anything that's decided or that goes on, even though they're really trying to take care of basic subsistence in their households. So there's been some things written about this, but they're not allowed to inherit or own property. They can briefly hold it kind of for their sons, but as soon as their sons come of age and are initiated into manhood, they have to give that to their sons. So there's no real way for them to build up an economic base. In addition, there's, even Dorothy Hodgson, an anthropologist who's worked with the Maasai for a really long time, has said, it's annoying when people characterize Maasai women as being helpless victims of men, but on the other hand, it's troubling the kinds of relationships that she's witnessed between a lot of Maasai men and women. So there is a sense of male superiority. The women can't do things without their husband's consent, and they often feel like they don't have a voice in family affairs or in community affairs because they're not supposed to have a voice. That's not what it means to be a good person. They also have a really long walk to water. So with in this state of drought, water insecurity, it's not unusual to see women carrying, multiple, these are huge, I don't even know, I'm not good at gallons, but these are huge containers of water. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this woman has on her back. So they have to walk about 4 hours to get water and 4 hours home. So they're getting up at 2 in the morning, walking all night to get water so they can get home in the morning and take care of children and other chores. So it's a very difficult life, a lot of heavy manual labor. In addition, there's a lot of gendered experiences of hostility and threat for the women. So there's a lot of, basically the research that I've done, the ethnographic research, all of this has suggested that, beating, hitting, kicking is pretty ubiquitous in the culture. And so my assistant said they didn't even think that our life events checklist properly captured that, because it's so widespread that people don't even really report it, or they're not comfortable talking about it. But there's a lot of fear between the men and between the women and the men. The women are afraid of the men, in other words, in a lot of cases, especially if they're vulnerable, like a lot of the women in our study. And finally, the women have a lot of children. So this is a image of an older mom, so they don't have any access to birth control, and they're certainly not, it's not considered to be a good thing to try and control the level of children that you have. So the average woman in our study had 6 children. and often a pretty powerless situation around reproduction. So the results of the study with the psychometric assessments and the interviews. So for the 71 women, we found that most of the women we interviewed were older, especially in a place with a life expectancy of probably 60 or so. But there's a pretty big standard deviation there. So, but they were, about 47 years old on average, so kind of postmenopausal. They, on average, as I mentioned earlier, had about 6 children. Most of them were not educated at all. We offered elementary school and things like that as options, but there was no education for 78%. The Kessler 10 score. Well, I'm going to talk about these scores on the next slide. So in terms of their psychometric scores across the sample, we had an average Kessler score of 27. In the West, that would indicate moderate disorder, moderate psychopathology, not of any specific kind, but probably depression or an anxiety disorder or something like that. And in terms of potentially traumatic events, they indicated about 4 each. 2 or more, as I mentioned earlier, would be considered clinically relevant in the US, would trigger a screening for PTSD. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these events were likely underreported around physical assault, sexual assault, unwanted sexual experiences was another one. And so I think that this might be even worse if all of that was able to be collected really carefully or more in depth. So in terms of hearing distressing voices, then we found that 39.4% of the women reported hearing distressing voices. So that's 28 out of the 71. And that's a really high amount. We would expect 7 to 10% in the general population of people might report hearing voices. We might even expect 10 to 15%. Some research has suggested, depending on how you ask the question, but we weren't expecting, around 40% to be the number, including when I compare against the regional research about hearing voices in East Africa and Kenya and the Luo groups and local groups, which is, I didn't lay all that out here, but I have done my homework in that regard. So the Kessler 10 score, so at this point, we decided to split people up by voice hearers and non-voice hearers. So we, as you can see here, a table where we're comparing subjects with hallucinations or voice hearing experiences. This should really say auditory verbal hallucinations, because I'm not talking at all about people who said they could predict the future or they had visual hallucinations. Those were a possibility, but I'm focusing only on verbal hallucinations here. So we had subjects with hallucinations, without hallucinations, and we found that on average, the Kessler 10 psychosocial distress score was higher for the women who experienced hallucinations, with a significance of 0.049 and a Cohen's-d of 0.503. And the LEC total score had a P of 0.073, which isn't significant, but we suspect that with a higher population, because the Cohen's-d indicated a small to moderate effect size, that we would have possibly a stronger significance in the LEC score with a larger sample. So as I mentioned, we compared these voice hearers, the 28, to the non-voice hearers in the sample. So to summarize, we found no significant difference between the groups in terms of demographic variables, although there were a few trends that maybe would emerge more strongly in a larger sample. We saw a significantly higher past 30-day psychosocial distress with a medium effect, and an almost significant higher number of traumatic life events with a small to medium effect. In a logistic regression model, the psychosocial distress predicted the presence of voice hearing, and the 28 women who heard voices reported higher stress levels and had experienced even more potentially traumatic events than other women in the study. So that was the sort of findings from our more quantitative instruments. Ethnographically and qualitatively, we found from our interviews that a lot of women's source of happiness, sense of moral well-being, of worth, of mental health, was centered around having livestock and children that were healthy and happy. And then they would say things like, happiness would never leave me, this huge trend across the data set. And so they called this having heart. And so the meaning of life for them was to have healthy and happy children and livestock, to keep the peace in the community, and to, sort of provide nourishment and growth for your family, which included your animals. And so this was very challenging to do for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier in this context of, severe food insecurity, child stunted growth, water insecurity. So we can sort of we can imagine what the women might have said were distressing to them, but I also asked them what was distressing to them. So the women who heard voices talked about their distress in these ways. They did talk, some of them flagged food insecurity as a great source of stress. Some mentioned water insecurity. Some mentioned loss of cattle as a way, something that would drive you crazy. Some mentioned problems with their husband, including, physical abuse, absent husbands distrusting them when they're migrating for work, and that causing tension in the marriage, and also alcohol abuse. So a lot of alcohol abuse for the women in their husband, not the women. They also talked about having miscarriages, losing children. I suspect there's some postpartum issues going on here that would be interesting to explore further and offer help around. 18% of them actually said, poverty is crushing me. Too much thinking, 29%, and with their local term, and then depression, 29%, and I forgot to list their local term, but it's inishoto for depression. So they are aware that there are these different causes. So we're not just mapping these causes onto them, they're also, flagging these issues themselves. So briefly, I'll just tell you that Nairokoki, which is a false name, but we know her also as L59 in the de-identified data set. But she told this story that kind of cuts across a lot of those categories. My husband left me behind with the children, no animals, no food, nothing. I was wearing the same piece of cloth for some years, and my children depended on the food I begged from my relatives and neighbors. I stayed 4 years without seeing my husband, and I was given a man to take care of me instead of my husband. Sometimes he can buy me food or sometimes not. And his wives were treating me bad because when they give me food, they tell me bad words. You depend and take the food, whether big or small. Your husband left you with children. I tell you, that thing destroyed my mind, and I was talking alone. Oh, my children. You think too much on how to handle the family, and this can make you talk alone if the burden is exceeding. This led me to talk within my heart, and now I find myself talking loudly along the way. In this area, this is my side note, talking to yourself is listed frequently as a sign of running mad, or alai riwa. This particular woman recovered by slowly learning to buy and sell charcoal to support herself financially, at which time she said, my problem ended. So when women describe their voices, they also talk about different causes. 29% talking about curses and witchcraft, 25% talking about poverty, 29% talking about depression, 29% talking about stress or thinking too much as what's triggering their voices when they experience them. When they talk about the sort of source of their voices or their relationship with their voices, about 20% of them think of the voices as positive, 50% think of them as negative, and 30% think of them as both. And some ascribe the voices to supernatural. Actually, almost everyone ascribed it to a supernatural cause, and some of them became more specific. Some thought it was God, some Satan, some demons, some dead relatives. And dead relatives is actually a traditional explanation in that area. Ancestral conversation wasn't considered to be unusual. Kitamarotoki was something 46% of the women mentioned. It's an experience of having a voice that a witch doctor has sent to haunt you, that you hear and that sort of taunts you. You can't find it anywhere, you're hearing it, you're looking all over, you say, Toka Shetani, go away, Satan, be gone, demon. And so Toki is from that sort of Toka Shetani kind of trait. And they did describe talking to the voices, although they acknowledged that that was dangerous and they weren't supposed to talk with their voices because, especially if they were demonic, that would indicate to others they might be practicing witchcraft. And yet a lot of them couldn't help it; they were compelling. So here's a woman who kind of had a mixed relationship with her voices. So just because they thought they were hearing God didn't mean they were positive, vice versa. Do you listen very carefully to the voices? I listen to both the bad and the God. Do they tell you what to do? Yes, they do. Like that of God, I was told to serve the Lord. Do the voices annoy you? This one of God, it really causes happiness in my heart, and I did what I was told to do, and I am in the house of the Lord. How about the bad one? That one wanted to kill my baby. Is the baby alive? Yes, the Lord was on my side because Satan wanted to swallow him. So in some instances, there's whole worlds of interaction going on between the voices. So there is a sort of culture bound syndrome that's been written about in the area called Orpeco. That's a spirit possession. So women have flagrant displays of spirit possession when they're struck by Orpeco. It's supposedly cured by Christian baptism, and Dorothy Hodgson, who's an anthropologist, has written extensively about this. And another researcher, Herskainen, did a big survey of all the case histories that he could find in 2004, and he found that there were 128 symptoms described as part of Orpeco across 91 case histories. But out of all those symptoms, only one woman reported hearing voices in that study. So also no one in my study used the word Orpeco to explain their experiences. So I think that's something different, and that this voice hearing experience has emerged, perhaps as a result of experiences of extreme hostility, threat, and fear stemming from the situation around climate change and the loss of land for cattle grazing and all the things that we talked about earlier. There's also a possibility of religious and spiritual influences. So about 96% of the women did describe themselves as Christian. And some more research could be mobilized, looking at how religion affects and shapes this experience of voice hearing. So overall, we found that there's 39% of the women are hearing voices. The voice hearers had experienced significantly more stress and seem more likely to be struggling with that stress than the women who did not hear voices, even though they were all living under pretty challenging conditions. We identified people who, I'm suggesting that identifying people who hear distressing voices may be an easily recognizable way to quickly find individuals who are struggling more than their peers and connect them to mental health support. And I want to add that mental health supports in the region need to mobilize religious and traditional healers and community health workers. So that's partly because there's so few resources for mental health in the area. Somewhere between 0 and 70 in this very low income setting. I only know of a handful of psychiatrists in Tanzania. There's 47 million people. So certainly mobilizing the help of what I think of as a caregiver network, I think would be most helpful for young people who are experiencing distress, or really anyone experiencing distress. If we could get their religious healers and traditional healers and possible educators, the hospital and clinic, and the family to kind of link together and work together. I think of this as sort of a life raft. And if the young person's sinking, then you can mobilize the different bubbles on the life raft and inflate them to help the person float. And the more of those bubbles that you can inflate, the better off a person is likely to be. And so to that end, I've been also done some research with religious healers and traditional healers in the area, and also looking at family support in the area, talking to families. This is a very desperate situation for families who have nothing like the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill or any kind of family support network there. So I think that would be tremendously helpful as well. So thank you so much, and I'll stop there. I appreciate your time.